Hello, and welcome to the final session of the 13th Annual Riverside Trauma Center Conference. I'm Liz Georgakopoulos, Senior Trauma Responder at Riverside Trauma Center, and I will be your moderator for today's session, Managing Sudden Loss in Schools, Communities, and Workplaces. Joining me today on our panel are Wahida Saif and Jim McCauley, both also from the Riverside Trauma Center, to share their expertise on grief and trauma. Now let us turn to our video introduction from Larry Berkowitz for today's session.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us in this conversation about managing sudden loss. When a traumatic sudden loss happens, there's a giant hole in the course of our daily lives. The poet and playwright Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote of such losses, "Where you used to be, there's a hole in the world, which I find myself constantly walking around in the daytime and falling in at night." Sudden loss shatters the structures and the assumptions that we live with and that organize us and the systems we're in on a daily basis. The work we're doing here at Riverside Trauma Center, going on 20 years now, has been to help systems, the organizations, the schools, the communities, the workplaces, to help them by accompanying them as they walk around those sudden losses, those sudden holes that have opened up, to help them respond and to react to the sudden shift in the narrative of their daily lives. It's about helping people, as the psychologist Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning, that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. So our goal has been to help people and systems understand that these strong reactions they have, the strong reactions to the ruptures in our sense of what should be, are to be expected. To know that there is an incredible range of reactions that we have. We react and reconstruct and heal in a whole variety of ways after tragic loss. There's no correct way. There's no correct way to act or to think or to feel after someone is tragically taken from us. I'm Larry Berkowitz, co-founder and director of Riverside Trauma Center, a sibling program of MindWise Innovations here at Riverside Community Care. My friends and colleagues, Wahida Saif, program coordinator, Jim McCauley, co-founder and associate director of the Trauma Center, along with senior trauma responder Liz Georgakopoulos, will share with you some of what we've learned along the way as we've taken that walk and accompanied these systems as they have dealt with the aftermath of stressful events. Our goal is to try to help those systems find their way back to functioning and to support those within their systems. The work we do sometimes follows a large-scale, high-impact event such as the Boston Marathon bombing or the tornadoes that happened in Massachusetts, gosh, over 10 years ago now. We helped lead the state's FEMA crisis counseling response program after the pandemic started. So sometimes it's these large-scale events, but more day-to-day what we're doing is helping a smaller organization like yours deal with the no less disruptive or painful events that happen. Our hope is that you've not had too much experience with that and that we can accompany you because we've been on this journey before and we've learned a lot from people like you who work in a variety of settings, helping us understand how best to help your community heal. Thank you again for joining us. This is our fourth and last in our learning series for this year, and we hope you'll engage and join us in the conversation today and continue to share with us what you've learned as we share with you. Liz, Wahida, Jim, I'll turn this over to you now.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Larry. We're going to start our questions off with Wahida. Can you tell us a bit about grief in general, as it's a really big topic? How can we go about wrapping our brains around this idea of grief?
Thank you, Liz. Welcome, everyone. My name is Wahida. That's a really good question and a really, really big, expansive one. So I'm going to try my best to give just touch points on that question. I'm certainly not going to hit everything, but I will try to encompass some points that I think are important along this topic of grief. Grief, as we understand it, is, one way that I like to think about grief is, lots of people will have different definitions of grief. So I'm not going to give you a definition of grief. I think we all have a working definition of grief. One way I like to understand grief is an attachment. At the base of it, grief is a severance of attachment, right? So when we would not grieve if we didn't have an attachment. So grief is the severance of an attachment. So it's a love connection that we had. And when we have a severance of that is when we grieve. So that's sort of, if you will, a jumping off point of understanding that. And we just an aside, we're going to be talking for probably the entirety of this presentation about grief as a loss to death, right? And a lot of it will be grief as a traumatic loss. But I do just want to preface this as, and say that that is not the only type of grief we experience. We experience grief in many, many forms. We experience grief when, if we especially understand it as severance of an attachment or a loss. We experience grief when we go through divorce, when we have migration, when we have separation, when we have forced separation or even voluntary separation, when we have material loss, when we have a loss of roles and identities, right? So and so many other kinds of losses. So I do want to say that while we probably won't have the time or the, to discuss all of those different types of losses, I do want to just at least pinpoint that there is profound grief experience when we do have those types of losses. So I want us to keep at least in the back of our mind, in the corner of our mind somewhere, that grief is experienced in all those different types of situations as well. I also want to mention, starting off by saying everything we're not going to talk about, but I want to just say while I want to at least acknowledge that we don't have the time to discuss this, we're also not going to get into the models of grief. And again, it's mostly a factor of time that we don't have to get into the models of grief. There's many, many models of grief out there, many really great ones. And the thing with models of grief is that I would encourage you to go and explore different models of grief. Some speak to, many will speak to you, some you will sort of read about and learn about and say, that doesn't sort of sit well, or I don't understand that, or I don't kind of like that, or I don't agree with that. And that's fine. You don't have to like every single model of grief, but I encourage you to sort of go and explore models of grief. One thing I just want to say very quickly is we are all sort of very familiar with the models of grief that we know as the stages of grief, like the 5 stages of grief. I would just suggest that we so not this one I'm going to get to very quickly, but the stages of grief that we know about or are familiar with sort of in pop psychology. I would just suggest that we sort of stay away from that one. Got very popular, the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross one, right? It became very popular, and I would suggest that we stay away from it only because if you don't know already, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was studying stages of grief. She was a hospice nurse, and she was studying stages of grief, or she came up with the stages of grief because she was studying people's own dealing with their own mortality, right? And because there was sort of this void, people sort of took it, and it was easy to apply to everything. So people sort of took it and sort of, took it and ran with it. But it doesn't necessarily apply when you're dealing with stages of dealing with how you are grieving somebody else's death. So that's why I would sort of suggest there are better models of grief out there if you are exploring models of grief. So perhaps not that one. Now I will say we can get into that Nick had put up. There are many models of grief out there, and they sort of, well, this is kind of what they go along, and I won't read all the stages out there up here. They're here for you to look at and read, but they sort of imply that you will, go through this nice sort of arc of grieving, right? That somewhere along the line you will hit all these nice stages of grief, and you will go along and sort of move along all these nice stages of grief, and go along your beautiful journey of grief, and come, you will start off in maybe some sort of a tumultuous place and end up in a better place, is sort of what they imply. But if you have experienced grief, and have experienced especially traumatic grief, or and later on we're going to get into what specifically traumatic grief is. What is, this little squiggly, this, that's really what the path of grieving really looks like. It's not this beautiful swoop that you go through, right? You sort of feel pulled back and forth and back and forth, and through all these different stages. That's what the journey through grief really feels like. Right? And that's what I think is important to keep in mind, because I think it's really been a disservice, especially when we've told people through the stages of grief model that, hey, you'll go through these nice, neat stages, and you'll come out through the end, and you'll be all nice and done, and don't worry. That's been a disservice when we've worked with people, that you'll be just fine as you work through your stages of grief, because that's not reality. That's not what grief really looks like, especially traumatic grief. Right. So that's, I think, really important to keep in mind. And again, like I said, we're going to get into traumatic grief a little bit more detail a little bit later. What's also really important to keep in mind, what makes things perhaps a little bit more complicated as you go through your grief journey, is this thing called cumulative grief, right? Cumulative grief, just like cumulative trauma, is just like the word sounds, right? Is this concept that if you have experienced grief before, if you've had more than one loss before, it's the piling up of one loss on top of another, right? That it's kind of like, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, right? It's like 1 + 1 equals like 50,000, right? Another way I like to explain it is that, if I had a wound here and I was sort of like walking, and I banged my hand against the desk, it would hurt differently. It would hurt more than if I didn't have a wound here or scar here from before. Not a scar, but a wound from before, right? And the important thing to keep in mind, that I think perhaps we have not realized or collectively sort of taken into account as a community, is that we have all, and when I say all, I mean all of us in the world, every single person, have experienced COVID. Every single one of us. Now, to different degrees, certainly. But that means that some of us have experienced COVID and have experienced losses from it. Some of us have experienced severe isolation because of it. Some of us have just, but certainly everyone has experienced some level. And remember my definition of loss from before, right? Loss isn't, and grief isn't just because of death, right? Grief is, also we expected the world to be a certain way and suddenly it was something different, right? That's also a form of grief. So all of us collectively have experienced COVID. That is one type of loss. So at the very least, we have that loss. And now if you have layered another loss on top of it, that's now cumulative grief, right? So cumulative grief, like that loss counts, that grief counts. And then anything else, you just layer that on top of it. So a very good example of this is if you've ever been to a funeral. Have you ever been to a funeral and people stand and talk about all the previous losses they've had? All the aunts and uncles they've lost before, their grandparents. There's a reason why we reminisce and remember those people we've lost before. Because new losses have a way of reminding us of all our previous losses. We sort of re-experience them, we remember them. So all of that comes back for us. So that it's important for us to keep in mind all of our cumulative losses. They may not be as painful or as fresh, but they're certainly present for us. I still have a few more points to cover. I've already been talking for a while. Is it okay if I keep going? Okay. Another sort of point, again, grief is a very large sort of topic. Another point that I think is important to talk about when we think about grief is the differences in how we experience grief and express grief across cultures. So certainly grief is something actually that we do really well as a human species across cultures. Like we all, a lot of communities call us in when they experience a loss and they're like, come, please help us. And we said, well, absolutely, we'll be there. But remember, you know how to do grief. You really know how to do grief. We'll be there, we'll help you, but you know how to do this. We know how to show up. We know how to console people. We know how to bring the casseroles. Actually, Nick, if you don't mind, could you put that slide up again? I'd like to walk people through that slide. But we do it differently across cultures. We think of death and dying and grief differently across cultures. In some cultures, there's an avoidance of death. Death is seen as something to avoid and at all costs. How long can we postpone it and sort of avoid it? But in some cultures, it's like this is a good thing. Let's sort of acknowledge it and sort of invite it in. In some cultures, when we experience grief, there's a suppression of affect, stiff upper lip, right? And in other cultures, people are really encouraged to express their affect. In some cultures, death is seen as a really unnatural event when we want to keep it as far away from us in our homes as possible. In other cultures, death is seen as really natural. Let's keep the body in the house, and it's totally fine. Let's be really one with it. In some cultures, death is seen as a passage from one life into the next. It's just from one phase of life into the next. In other cultures, that's it. It's the ending. For some people and certain circumstances, death is seen as a welcome event. And again, in other cultures and different circumstances, death is seen as a really unwelcome event, depending, right? And the last thing I just want to touch upon is, and it's a very, very big topic, so I won't get into it at all right now. But there's a huge range of issues when we think about children and death, right? In many cases, children do deal with death way better than adults do, right? We have all kinds of adult issues with death, and kids just come about it much more innocently than we do. There's the young, I'll just say very briefly that the younger the kids, sometimes they don't understand the permanence of death, and we might have to repeat things several times to them. That sometimes freaks out adults, and we think that they're traumatized perhaps, or why they keep asking us again, or maybe they don't quite and it's just that they don't understand that death is permanent or something like that. Or they might go around repeating, my dad died, my dad died, my dad, did you know my dad died? And it's like, yeah, he died. It's very normal for kids to ask or repeat things like that over and over again. And, so I'll just say very simply, we never ever encourage lying to kids, no matter what, no matter how young, no matter how bad the circumstances. We always say, tell them the truth, find ways to tell them the truth. We can get into that later if we have time. But there's lots of great resources out there for how to go about telling kids the truth and how to do it in developmentally appropriate ways. But I'll stop here because we have lots of other topics to cover. But thank you.
Thanks so much, Wahida. Jim, the next question I have is for you. And this is another really broad topic, but can you start the conversation on traumatic grief, how it's different from grief in general, and perhaps even some of the subcategories within it, such as suicide loss specifically?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think when we talk about traumatic grief, I think the association is often to things like a fatal car accident, a homicide death, maybe a natural disaster, and of course, suicide. And I think one of the most important things to consider when we're thinking about traumatic grief is just how much more of an impact that it has on our whole being. We have a slide, I think, that sort of shows you just sort of how major the impact can be. And I think when we sort of talk about grief and certainly anticipatory grief, when people sort of have a heads up that their loved one is in the process of dying, they've got time to sort of prepare themselves emotionally and physically and in every other way, legally, financially. But with the traumatic grief, we see a much larger impact. So with the domain slide, I think sort of that the emotional reactions that we typically associate with having a loss, just the sadness, the anger, maybe some guilt if it's a traumatic loss, those are significant. But there's far more important domains, the 6 domains that we talk about. If you put that slide up, Nick, on the domains, number 1 is sort of are those emotional reactions, and number 2 are the cognitive reactions. People really feel like they can't think very well for themselves. They feel like their memory is shot. They feel like their concentration is shot. They have a conversation with somebody and they walk away, and then 10 minutes later they say, I don't remember anything at all about that conversation. And that's a pretty normal or pretty common reaction that people have when the grief is more traumatic. Behavioral, we see changes. People withdraw. They may be more short fused. We see that sort of our whole body sort of may enter into some kind of a fight, flight, or freeze possibility that we see. I often tell school principals when there's been a traumatic loss in a school that, you very well may see more fights in the hallway this week. You may see more punch lockers. So those behavioral reactions are pretty powerful. And then the physical reactions that people have, hyperarousal, hypervigilance are very common, but also just where that trauma lands in your body. And one of the things that we always say is the first place that trauma goes is to the body. And so, and the implications for that is that the cure is in the body. So, helping people stabilize, making sure that, if we're ever sort of meeting with groups after a traumatic event, we're always sort of talking with them about taking care of themselves physically, making sure that they're staying hydrated, that they're eating, that they're paying attention to their sleep. These are all important things, and certainly sleep is probably the number 1 barometer for how we're doing after a traumatic event. And then what happens to relationships that we have? oftentimes the people experience such intense pain after a traumatic loss that they really isolate themselves. They might cut themselves off from their social support network. And one of the things that we want to do pretty quickly is help restore them to that, to those social connections, help them rebuild that. And then the sort of what we call the spiritual and existential domain, that often, for some people, it may, depending on their religious beliefs, they may say that the fact that I have my strong religious beliefs, that's the major thing that's helped me get through this awful situation. Other people may have a completely 180 reaction and say, I can't believe that my God would let this happen to me. So you see this whole range of reactions, but I think oftentimes what we see too is certainly when, Wahida was sort of talking about cumulative grief and cumulative loss. I think oftentimes what we see are people feeling like they're just not as good as they were before. They don't feel positive. They may say things like, I used to look forward to getting up on Monday morning and going to work, and now I find it's really hard to get out of bed. I used to think I was really good at this job, and now I'm not so sure. And what we see, if that continues, and if there's multiple losses or multiple traumatic events with people, oftentimes what we see ultimately is burnout if it's not addressed early on. And the major thing that we recommend for people who are experiencing any of these reactions in these different domains is we want you to notice your reactions. We don't want you to make judgments about what's happening. We don't want you to say, what's wrong with me? This is the third night in a row that I haven't slept. What we want you to do is just notice them, almost like you're a third party looking in and saying, no, that's interesting. This is the third night in a row that I haven't slept well. And if you do that, if you notice your reactions and don't be judgmental about them, we encourage you to do that, not just because we want you to be kind to yourself, but also because we know that it's neurobiological. If we can get it from the back of the brain up to the front of the brain, where we can do some good problem solving, those reactions will go away a lot quicker. And usually people will feel, if they're sort of struggling, they'll usually start to feel some improvement within 2 to 4 weeks after a traumatic event, after a traumatic loss, particularly. And we always say to people, if after a month or so you don't feel like you're getting any better, you feel like you're stuck, that's a good time to get a consult with a mental health professional or perhaps with your primary care physician. And just to talk a little bit more about this sort of difference between grief and trauma, we have a slide that addresses that. Oftentimes with grief, what we see, put the whole slide up there. Thanks. Oftentimes what we see with grief is that the prominent emotion is sadness. Whereas with trauma, it might actually be fear. So, you see this, this is quite a bit of difference between grief versus trauma. Oftentimes grief will run its course over time, slowly as we find ways to stay connected, other ways to stay connected to our loved one. We'll start to feel like we're doing better. Whereas if you don't get support after a traumatic event, you risk developing post-traumatic stress disorder. With grief, pain is an acknowledgement of the loss. It's a reminder. It's a reminder of the person that's no longer in your life anymore, physically. And so that pain is something that we sort of encourage people to sort of think about. And one of our mentors for many years at the Trauma Center is Jack Jordan, and he used to sort of talk about just this ability to kind of dose your grief. But for trauma, that pain can actually be triggering for people, increase their sense of sort of feeling powerless and helpless. And grief tends not to distort the self-image of the bereaved, whereas with trauma, it oftentimes impacts our sense of who we are. You know, we feel like we're not in control anymore. We're powerless. Maybe even feel like we're not a good person anymore. So you can see how many differences there are, and rarely with any kind of sort of anticipatory grief do we see any kind of trauma reactions such as flashbacks or hypervigilance or numbing. Whereas after a traumatic event, those are much more common reactions that we see. That sort of hypervigilance and and intrusive images can be fairly common in some situations.
Jim, can you tell me what you meant about dosing your trauma? Sorry, dosing your grief, not your trauma.
Yeah. So Jack Jordan sort of talks about this idea of dosing your grief, that we don't want people to be grieving 24/7 after a loss. I mean, I think people need to start getting pieces of their life back together. They sort of, are trying to help stabilize what's been happening to them. They've got other obligations in their life of maybe making sure that they're taking good care of their family, that they can sort of go back in some way and start to maybe work again and get involved in the community again. And it's not helpful if you are thinking that you need to be grieving all of the time. So having a more focused approach to your grief, maybe even at times just sort of limiting it to a couple, an hour or two a day, doing it in a very planful way. Oftentimes people find things like bibliotherapy really helpful, reading about loss that can feel very comforting to people. Talking with others that have had a loss, we really encourage that. So these are some of the things that I think are ways that you typically can dose your grief. And then, Liz, you were asking about suicide loss specifically, and I think we know that suicide death is always complicated, but suicide loss is complicated as well. And you can sort of see all these different reasons why grief following a suicide death is more complicated. It may be sudden, it may be unexpected. We had no idea that our loved one was in such pain that they would think about so much pain and hopelessness that they would think about ending their life. And then we know that even today, despite all of our efforts, there is still so much stigma and shame attached to a suicide loss. We've had families who describe what we sort of call the supermarket aisle experience, where after a loss of a family member, they're in the supermarket, shopping down one aisle, and a neighbor sort of comes from the other direction, makes the turn and comes from the other direction and sees the family and very quickly does a 180 and goes back. And we know it's just because they don't know what to say. I mean, they don't mean to sort of shame their neighbors, but that's very much what it feels like. And they just feel completely cut off from other people, and it just increases the shame so much. Oftentimes there may be guilt involved after a suicide death. I should have known my loved one was struggling. I should have seen this coming. Maybe I didn't do enough. So self-blame is very, very common experience for people. Suicide always engenders the why question. People want to know, why would somebody do that? And they start searching for answers, and oftentimes it really does become a teachable moment. People are very interested in understanding suicide loss. They're very interested in understanding the dynamic of suicide. Just sort of what happens? Why would somebody do that? So that search for why is extremely common. And then, could I have intervened? Was it preventable? Again, Jack Jordan talks about this idea of the tyranny of hindsight, that we go back and we analyze every conversation that we ever had with our loved one, every interaction that we had with them. And if I had intervened in a different way, if I had said something in a different way, would he or she still be alive? And then oftentimes people say, well, maybe he didn't really mean to kill himself. Maybe he was just trying to send a signal that he was struggling, or maybe he was experimenting, not knowing for sure whether the person actually meant to kill themselves can be very confusing and feel very complicated for people. I think the statistics are still that only about 30 to 35% of people who die by suicide leave a suicide note. And if they don't, that really makes us wonder about volition. And of course, this is now a huge issue with our national opioid crisis. I think anywhere from 25 to 50% of opioid deaths are thought to be a suicide death. So it can be really confusing about why our loved one died, and did they really mean to die? The anger can be very powerful. It can feel like our loved one betrayed us. Why did they leave me? Why did they do that to me? It can just feel like such a sense of abandonment. And then, a lot of you have probably seen some of the CDC statistics about the number of people who struggle every year with suicidal thoughts. And generally, when the CDC does that every other year research, they estimate that over 12 million people in the US every year think seriously about suicide. And so, for some of us, this might engender fear of our own impulses. If this person that I knew and loved and respected killed himself, if he felt like he couldn't continue, what does that say about me? And so it's very common for people that have had a suicide loss to also sort of think about their own suicidality. And also a lot of times, and I think this is an issue, and when we talk about contagion, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but oftentimes I think people who are struggling, who are overly empathic, may actually be thinking in that moment, I wonder what was going through my loved ones or my friends' thoughts, during those final minutes of his life, and sort of try to put themselves there and imagine what that was like. So, and then the trauma of the death, if we have heard details about how our friend or how our loved one died, we can have really intrusive images, and we certainly discourage people. We want to be very open when we can be, if a death was a suicide death, acknowledging that it was a suicide death, but we really discourage talking about the means because it really could result for people feeling that they can't sort of get those images out of their head. A lot of states are always behind in the medical examiner reports. Certainly, if a suicide death was an overdose, it may take months before we have final details from the medical examiners. So that period of waiting, can be really agonizing for families and friends. And then also, very often after a suicide death, the police are involved. You often hear on the news, for example, that a death has happened in a community. It's on the news, and the media saying, well, there's no need for anyone to worry. They're sort of implying that it was a suicide death and not a homicide death. But imagine, if we're talking about stigma, what that's like for a family, that the police come to your home, they're investigating your loved one's death as a crime. And in some cases, your house may be completely surrounded by that yellow police investigation tape. So it can just feel very beyond a stigma, very humiliating to families and very shaming. So you can see that these are just some of the reasons that that grief after suicide can be so much more powerful and complicated.
Thank you so much, Jim. Oftentimes we respond in the state of Massachusetts to suicide deaths, and many folks here might not know exactly what that might look like. So Wahida, could you talk about when the trauma center is called to come to a workplace or a community right after any type of loss? What does that look like? What support do we provide? And how can we be helpful to the folks that have called us?
Oftentimes when we are called out, well, first of all, when, often when we go, and we like to say that we are, while we, and this is not to toot our own horn, but we are often considered experts in the field of, certainly crisis response. It's known by many names, right? Crisis response, critical incident response, trauma response, whatever, by whichever name you like to know it as. But we still like to go in and consider ourselves guests in the space we enter. What that means is that while we bring a certain expertise in the field of crisis response, we still do not know your culture and how you operate and how you do things. So we will, while we will offer our expertise on the subject matter, we still will take your or not take your input. You are experts on your culture, how, whether it's your workplace culture, your school culture, your community culture. And when I say community culture, that means the culture of your city, the culture of your religious community, the culture of your ethnic community, whatever culture, because every space has its own culture, right? So you are the experts of your culture, and we're the subject matter experts. And there needs to be a blend of those two in order to have the quote unquote perfect response. There's no perfect response, but you know what I mean, right? And so you bring the expertise of your culture, we bring the expertise of the subject matter, and hopefully together with both of those, we can come up with a plan that can have the perfect response to whatever situation is on hand. Now, not knowing any of the specifics of what exactly, this whatever it is, the response that we're responding to, the incident that we're responding to, just some generalities. And speaking in generalities, we, some of the basics of the response are, some overarching principles, so to speak, are, one mantra we sort of always say is, we advise people to operate from this premise of you want to have routine and structure with flexibility. No, people think they want lots and lots of flexibility. They don't, right? It's sort of like your toddler. They think they want like ice cream at 2 a.m. in the morning. They don't. People need routine and structure, right? An example of that is, if you're in a school system, the bells need to ring on time. Kids need to change classes on time. No matter whatever has happened, that predictability needs to be there. Because if it's not there, if you cancel classes, if you say, this awful, awful, awful thing has happened, we're going to cancel classes, and everyone's just going to sit in the auditorium all day mourning, right? That takes away the structure and predictability that provides them structure, that gives them the structure they need to provide that holding environment. right? So if bells ring on time, classes change on time, they have that predictability of, and I'm just using this as an example, to change classes, to go to that next class, to go to that next class. And maybe that next class is their favorite teacher who they can rely on to go to and have that heart-to-heart talk with, right? Maybe that's exactly what they need in that day, in their worst day ever. Maybe that's exactly what they need. Now, the really important phrase in that is with flexibility, right? Because some kids won't be able to make it through the day. They won't be able to change classes when the bell rings. Maybe it's that they lost their very best friend and they just won't be able to change classes when the bell rings. Maybe they won't be able to even make it to that first class, right? Maybe they need to go to their counselor's office and just sit there all day long, right? That's where the with flexibility comes in. So you can't be completely stringent about these rules. So you need to really have routine and structure with lots of flexibility. So routine and structure doesn't mean you go to math class and the math test happens, right? It means all the bells ring and everything happens on schedule with lots and lots of flexibility for everybody who needs it, including the teachers, including staff, including the counselors, right? Because the counselors also had that kid, right? So that's a really good sort of framework to operate with. Another thing to, I'm just giving some nuts and bolts. I'm clearly not going to be able to cover everything. Some things to think about is who do you notify and how do you notify them? Some just, you never want to notify, do notifications, whether it's notifications of a loss of a student or faculty or staff or anything like that on a PA system, right? That's not how anyone wants to find out. By the way, and I don't have any data to back this up, this is just from some years of experience. I've learned that, when I've sat with people over the years, one thing that stood out for me is how they have found out has become part of their sort of narrative, their trauma narrative, right? Like, I found out this way. And so how they have found out has become a really important part of their story. So if you're going to tell someone some important piece of news, it's really important to think, put a little bit of thought into how they're going to find out this important piece of information, right? So I'm a huge advocate of yes, people should, people should get the same information. They should get it, it's important to write out scripts. It's important to people get the same consistent information. So scripting is really important, that kind of thing. Keep it short. People can't process a lot of information, that kind of thing. But if at all possible, tell people in person, call them, don't text them, that kind of thing. Make a list of the most important people you think should find out the information first, whether it's staff, whether it's students. If you're going to tell students, obviously their families should know first. And the family should be telling their students. You should not be telling the students, difficult news about their friends, things like that. And just being very planful. And then, another piece of information that I've always thought, or, one thing that we always sort of think about is when a critical incident happens, right? When something, or a big bad, right? I always think about like a big bad happens. It can be incredibly overwhelming to think about it in terms of like, how am I going to now plan for this forever, right? The long term. Planning for a big bad thing for a very long time is very hard. So you break it down into small chunks, right? You just have to get through today. Now, this applies whether you're a school, whether you're in a workplace, whether you're a community, right? You have to get through today. And if it's a death that you're dealing with, you have to get through till the services. Then you think about, okay, now we're gonna get through the day of the services, the day after, like right after the services, right? So if you're dealing with kids, teenagers, kids, what are they gonna do right after services? Where are they gonna go? There should be a plan for that. Where are these kids going? Whose house, whose basement are they hanging out in the day after the time after the funeral? It should be that detailed. Who's going to have eyes on them the day after the funeral, the day of the funeral, right afterwards, and then the day after. And so it's Thursday today, right? What's going to happen on Friday? What's going to happen the first weekend? And then once you get through that first weekend and services, you can start planning in 2-week increments. Right? So you don't have to go way beyond that, 2-week increments. And then you can start thinking, like if you're a school system and it's April, you can say, okay, what are we doing for prom? What are we doing for graduation? And then you can say, what's our plan for the summer? Because if you say, what are we doing for the rest of the school year? That's overwhelming, right? So you break it down into really, really small chunks. And then you also make lists like, who are the kids we're most worried about? Who's the second tier out? Who's the third tier out? Who are the kids on the sports team with him? Who are the teachers most associated? But then you also make things like if it was a death due to, I'm just giving sort of examples, a death because of a cancer. Are there any other students who are undergoing cancer treatment? Are there any teachers or staff undergoing cancer treatment? Right? Are there any other teachers who have lost any children to cancer? So you want to think sort of in other threats too. So not directly related to the child, but sort of who would have other sort of peripheral associations. You might want, and they may be doing just fine. Like maybe you want to reach out to them and just do a check-in. Right? So I'm just giving you some examples of how you may want to just be thinking about planning. And I know, Liz, you asked the question of like, when we go to a community, how do we sort of help them through? These are just some of the ways we help, like, for example, a school system. We would do similar things if we went into a workplace, and a similar thing if we went into a community. Of course, they call us in for all kinds of different things. I just gave one example. But it's very similar sort of way of thinking when we go into communities. We sit with them. And of course, we are plan, like I said in the beginning, we sit with them. Again, we may be subject matter experts, but they're the experts on their community. So we don't just plan in a vacuum and say, here's what we think you should be doing, but it's very much, and what are the nuances of your community that we don't know, we couldn't possibly be thinking of, that you think we need to take into account when planning out this response. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wahida. We do lots of different interventions when we go into a community too, so it's good to think about the vast array of things that we can offer. And I was taking a note down when you were talking, just thinking about how every response is unique and different, and so we can't say that like one shoe fits all. It's just going to be so different because no two communities are alike. And I really like that you talked about that. Jim, I know that you have recently talked to school leadership after the loss, suicide loss of a student. What advice did you give to them specifically about handling a suicide loss?
So we really appreciate and when schools call us right away after they've learned of a suicide death in their school or a traumatic loss, we really encourage them to call us right away and just have a conversation with them about what some of our recommendations, what might be. And we always consider ourselves to be consultants. You know, we just encourage schools to sort of brainstorm with us, hear us out, hear our recommendations, and then do what's best for their school community. We know we're very well, as Wahida was talking about, you know, we're very aware that every school is its own city, idiosyncratic community with its sort of own values and ways of operating. And so they may want to do something different, but we do encourage them to sort of talk with us and hear us out. But when I was having a conversation with this school leadership team, it was the superintendent, the principal, assistant principal, head of guidance, and they were sort of asking for ideas about how to manage this response. And the first thing I talk with schools about is, as much as possible, can you be transparent? Can you be transparent with the students, your faculty, parents, and as well as the local community? And the first way that you can do that is really to sort of think about sending a message to everybody in your school community about the loss, what the plan is for following up. We even say, tell people what you don't know. So if you don't know what the funeral plans are yet, tell them you don't know, and you will let them know once you find out. And for that letter, if you are going to acknowledge that this was a suicide death, then we want to make sure that you have reached out to the family and you have permission. And this can always be a tricky area because I think sometimes families are not yet ready to acknowledge that death was a suicide death, which can be pretty understandable. They may be in complete shock and just need time to sort of process this. But when a family can acknowledge it and give a school permission to say that this was their son or daughter's death was a suicide death, that's a really powerful intervention tool. It can really help the school be much more transparent and helpful with kids acknowledging what happened. So we always want schools to reach out to the parents right away. Now, even in some cases, the school may have had a very antagonistic relationship with the parents. There may have been concerns over the years that the school wasn't doing enough for the student's educational plan, that they weren't intervening if there had been bullying going on, and you're very possibly likely to have a door slammed in your face. But we still want you to reach out, and because I think one of the worst things that you can experience as a school leadership team is to basically have people say that we never heard anything from the school. No one from the school ever contacted us. So you don't want that to happen. And I think I always hate to say this, but a suicide death, you know, you have to sort of think about, you know, I was telling this school that you have to sort of think about a public relations aspect to this. Suicide is scary, and when people get scared, they blame. And so, you know, very often we hear people say, you know, this is the school's fault. The school didn't do enough. The school doesn't take good enough care of kids. There's too much bullying going on. They're not managing social media right. And you really see these scared parents sort of come out and start blaming the school. And so, being as transparent as you can, and thinking about your response and how you're going to respond, and trying to be as transparent as you can be a really effective strategy. I was telling the school that when you start school tomorrow, gather the teachers first thing before school starts. Just check in with them, let them know what the plan is, let everybody know what the plan for the day is going to be, and then check in with them at the end of the day as well. So oftentimes for the first few days, you sort of heard Wahida talking about the importance of really sort of chunking your response into days, maybe days and weeks at a time. But those first several days, you probably want to have a very short meeting with your faculty at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, just to sort of assess the temperature in the building and sort of find out what people's experiences have been. I also told the school, it's something that I tell all schools, that when you are thinking about supporting your students, you're always thinking of at least two groups of kids. You're thinking about kids who have lost a friend and a classmate, and they may be grieving for that loss. They may be really upset and grieving. Ultimately they're going to be okay, but you're sort of trying to manage the grief and how can you support them in their grief. But then you have a group of kids who are very vulnerable. They may have their own history of struggling. They may have their own history of suicidality. Oftentimes this can be anywhere from 5 to 10% of your school population, that you want to make sure that they're getting the support that they need because of their own vulnerability. They may or may not have known the student who died, but they certainly have heard about it. And now, perhaps because of their own struggles, they're thinking themselves about this as a possible option. So you're thinking about those two groups of kids, and what you're offering them is going to be something that's quite different. In some rare cases, you may have a third group of kids that knew what was happening. They may have been there at the time of the death or right after the death. They may have these traumatic images that we were sort of talking about earlier, or they were getting texts from their friend in the middle of the night, or they were out looking for him or her. So those kids are going to need a lot more support, certainly to sort of manage those traumatic responses that they've just endured. And I think that the other thing that we always sort of encourage schools to do is to bring in those outside experts, whether it's the trauma center or a local mental health agency. Again, that feels like transparency. So kids are not going around saying, the school's trying to hide what happened, the community's trying to hide what happened. And the kids also know that the faculty, the staff, they're getting support as well. Because faculty and staff, the adults are always telling kids to take care of themselves, but kids have radar for authenticity. And if adults are saying, take care of yourself, and you're not the adults aren't taking care of themselves, what you see are the kids sort of noticing that right away and basically saying, well, if the adults aren't doing it, why should I do it? So I think that transparency is really helpful. And then, Wahida made reference to this, the impact on a community. And we have seen this so often when there's been a cluster of suicide deaths in a community where there's just so much sense of community feeling ashamed, embarrassed, helpless. So oftentimes, you're thinking about a much larger response. You're not just thinking about that particular school building. You may have a death in a high school, but that second grade teacher, had that child when they were young, and they're grieving as well, and they need support. You may have younger siblings in the junior high or middle school or in the elementary school that are also going to need support. You've got neighbors that watch this kid grow up next door to them, and they're grieving as well. So oftentimes, we encourage schools to sort of think about a community-wide response. And when we're doing that, one of the, I think, most powerful interventions that you can do after a suicide death, and certainly after there has been multiple deaths, is you can really talk about what we call shifting the narrative. And really what that means is that, we're sending out messages to the school and to the community that we don't want something like this to ever happen again. We want everybody to sort of feel like they have a role in suicide prevention. We want to get messages out, for example, to let people know treatment works. There's multiple pathways to getting help. If you're in a suicidal crisis, let us know, and we will stick with you and make sure that you get the help that you need. If one way of getting help doesn't work, we'll find another way. We'll just keep plugging and help you until you get to the right place. And that's that authentic hope that we often talk about. Again, we know that hopelessness, pain, and hopelessness are always a major part of a suicide death. And so, that authentic hope is actually an antidote to that hopelessness. So getting that word out is really key. We want to get a message across that nobody worries alone. We want you to reach out, and asking for help is a sign of strength. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. So these are some of the things that we sort of talk about when we sort of talk about shifting the narrative. I think they can be really powerful interventions. And again, Wahida referenced the need for a longer term suicide prevention plan. Kids tell us, we don't want postvention to end at the funeral. It really should be, you're thinking about the rest of the school year, over the summer, into the next school year, your suicide prevention plan. What are you going to do to sort of support kids and make sure that something like this doesn't happen again? Oftentimes, kids may have heard about how their friend died. They may have some very gory details, and we ask them not to share that. When you talk with kids about this concept of vicarious trauma, that even if other people weren't there and they hear these details, they might have this experience of sort of having intrusive images, and they might not be able to shake that and get it out of their head. So we say, if please don't share that. And one of the things that we say too is that one of our mantras for schools is that we want you to remember how your friend lived, not how they died. So let's sort of talk about ways that you want to remember him. Let's think about a time that you were together and you were having a lot of fun, or he or she said something really funny or did something that was incredibly supportive to you or to somebody else. And let's build out that story. So, where was it, and who else was around, and what was the temperature, and were there any smells in the air? Really sort of build out that image so that when you start to have intrusive images, you can do what we call image replacement and think about the ways that you want to remember your friend rather than how he died. So these are some of the things that we do. I alluded to before, I alluded to sort of talking about this issue of vulnerable kids. And we talk oftentimes about a suicide contagion, and we oftentimes think about it with this younger group. And we have a slide, I think, that demonstrates some of the key points for this. When we're talking about suicide contagion, we're talking oftentimes that high-risk group is that 15 to 24-year-old age group. So we're really talking about, middle school through college age kids that are more susceptible to this notion of contagion. And contagion is basically just the knowledge that a suicide death influences a subsequent suicide death. Oftentimes, I think the sort of current thinking is that for this population, that anywhere from 2 to 5% of adolescent suicide deaths are the result of contagion. And oftentimes, it's not the best friends. It's those vulnerable kids that we were talking about. They may, maybe they had a class with a student who died. Last year, maybe they were on the same Little League team when they were in the 4th grade together. So they may know of him or her, but they really were not close. We think that the good friends sort of understand the impact that this death has had on the family. And for that reason, that they are a lot less susceptible. And then the other sort of common thing that you hear about oftentimes is a cluster. And that basically is just an excessive number of suicide deaths occurring in a close time frame and in a close geography. When we started doing this work 20 years ago, before the main impact of social media, we would get a call from a high school or a workplace, and we would go in and provide support to that building, and that would pretty much be the end of it. Well, now we hear from neighboring high schools, we hear from churches and synagogues and dance clubs and traveling sports teams. There's so much more impact that a death has these days, and so it's much harder to sort of figure out clusters. But talking about contagion and clusters, I think the sort of time frame is important. Most of the research around contagion, I think, is generally in the sort of the 2 to 4 week period after a suicide death. And certainly you see public conversations about suicide deaths in the newspaper. And so, for example, we saw increased rates of suicide deaths after Robin Williams died by suicide, after Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade killed themselves a few years ago. We saw increasing rates, but by and large, we're sort of talking about those sort of vulnerable kids in a school or a work setting. But more than contagion, our experience at the trauma center has been what we just refer to as a cohort. So, for example, you have a high school where a sophomore dies by suicide, and then 2 years later, that class are seniors, and you have 2 kids in that class who die by suicide. And then they go off to college, and during their 4 years in college, 2 or 3 of those kids end up killing themselves. So, that cohort, it's not within that 2 week or 4 week period, it's much longer. And we had one experience where we had a school where there had been 4 suicide deaths in an 18-month period of young people starting out when they were in the 8th grade. By the time that class was 28 years old, there had been 13 deaths in that community. So, it really, the cohort implies that there's an increased lifetime risk of suicide death. Again, it's a small percentage, very small percentage, but it is an issue, and it's something that we've seen.
Just thinking about the postvention that we offer, Jim, especially after a suicide loss, could you talk a little bit about our recommendations on memorials that we often have these conversations with schools and communities and workplaces?
Yeah, so we tend to discourage permanent memorials, and but I do want to say up front that there's been no research around this topic, but our experience and the anecdotal experience that we've heard from so many schools over the years is that permanent memorials can be sort of very upsetting for people, very distracting. We've had experiences where parents have wanted a bench out in front of the high school with their child's name on the bench and with the date of birth and date of death. And, the school is very reluctant to do that. I mean, you think about schools. I mean, schools are about the future. They're about life-affirming goals. And so that bench is there, 10 years later, and you've got a freshman student walking into the building for their first day of school, and here's this bench. commemorating the suicide death of someone who died 10 years ago. We've had experiences where a school has planted a tree in honor of a student who died by suicide. Well, then then there's other deaths over the years, and now you've got 3, 4, 5 trees, and kids refer to it as the suicide forest. So it oftentimes backfires. But again, thinking about this connection that we keep making about suicide being a traumatic event and trauma making us feel powerless and helpless, people want to do things. So, the memorial activities should be something that is in the suicide prevention realm or something that supports other kids. And so, for example, when kids say, but we want to remember our friend, we say, well, how about participating in a road race that raises money for suicide prevention? How about doing the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention Walk Out of Darkness, and raising money for suicide prevention? Or how about doing some kind of other fundraiser for a scholarship for kids graduating from your particular high school? So we do want to encourage that, and we want to be really careful that we're always striking a balance, that we want to make sure that we're not glorifying a suicide death, but that we're also not preventing or not trying to hide it either. I think, and it can be an extremely difficult tightrope to walk.
Can I just add a couple of points to that? So this whole conversation is about grief, right? And I started off this conversation saying we grieve because we are attached to something that is then lost, right? So the whole idea of memorials, the reason people push and are motivated to memorialize something is because they're grieving, right? So when Jim says it's a tightrope to walk, that's commemoration is we do memorials because we're driven to commemorate the life that is lost, which is, we should. There's nothing wrong with that. But this act, it's the idea of the permanent memorial, which is the one we want to stay away from, right? So I would add that if you are in we have a lot of people here, if you're in any position to to write a policy and you don't have a policy, like today, go and write a policy. Because the thing is, if you have not had a loss, you consider yourself lucky, but going into the future, it is much easier to point to a policy and say, I'm so sorry, but we have a written policy that says we cannot have permanent memorials, right? Than to, in the moment, say, I'm so sorry, we cannot have a permanent memorial. And the thing is, we're not saying to not have any memorialization activities or take that back, commemoration activities, but to have life-affirming commemoration activities, but not like permanent tree planting, bench making activities, right? There's a difference. I would also say, like, T-shirts and bands that have like faces and like those are also, and we've heard this again anecdotally, are incredibly triggering for people, because the thing is, like, in the few days after, people expect to see them, but like when someone 6 months later is in a different place in their healing journey, and then someone shows up to school with a T-shirt on with the face of a person who has passed, it's incredibly difficult for people, right? So if you can have just a written policy that already says, listen, these are the acceptable things we will do for commemoration for any kind of death, by the way. It shouldn't just be suicide death, right? That's the other really key factor. You should just have a blanket policy for all deaths. And these are the ones that are not allowed. These are the ones that are allowed. It just makes it easier for everyone across the board. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I echo that, Wahida. There's many times we go into a school and there's no policy, and so it's a constant conversation about the permanent memorials, and we had a question come in about temporary memorials, and I do think that you addressed that. And I will just say, often having a card making station or a poster or decorating the locker is something that is okay, as long as there's a date at which that will come down and be passed off to the family. We've seen that work really well. Wahida or Jim, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say, just to be really transparent with kids about that, so that if you are planning to sort of take those notes and drawings off of a locker, let students know, or if you're going to change the seating arrangement in a classroom, let kids know when they walk into the building next week, on Monday morning, it will look different, and here's what we're going to do, and here's why. So just being really transparent and giving kids a heads up is really important.
So they're not surprised. I also see part of that question is honoring them at graduation. And I think the best solution to that is just saying their name at the beginning.
Of graduation. And not, what I mean is not where it would fall alphabetically. Because I think that if you sort of play that out in your head, like imagine the anticipation of like, oh, now their name is going to come, now their name is going to come. And the poor child whose name comes before and after, like that's way too much for those poor children, right? So honor them, say their name, like acknowledge their loss at the beginning. And then you move on with their ceremony. And if they were going to graduate, I don't know, I think maybe Jim, it was you, or I think it was you who suggested this, giving their diploma to the parents in a private ceremony, like in the principal's office or something. It seems like a really good alternative to me.
Yeah, thank you. If you do have questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A section, but I'm just going to keep going for now until we get any other questions coming in. So Wahida, towards the beginning of our time together, you mentioned talking to young children about death. Could you say a little bit more about ways that that can be done effectively and age appropriately?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I will
Preface this by saying that
I don't think that unless you are related to the child and or have a very sort of connection to a child, should be used to the child ourselves. But a lot of times we find ourselves in
sort of consultative roles, right, to parents or caregivers, guardians of very young children. In that case, I think it's appropriate to sort of give them advice on how to tell very young children about a death in their family. I think we have perhaps a slide for this, yes. And you know, I was saying this earlier, that it's imperative that we tell children the truth. I promise you, we've never, ever come across an adult who's come back to us and said, you know, I know you did it for my own good. I know you were trying to protect me. Thank you so much for lying to me when I was younger. That just never happens. So always tell them the truth. Find the language to do it. Use clear language, no euphemisms. So I know we like to say as adults things like they went to sleep, they went away, you know, they're in heaven now. It's okay to use religious imagery if that is something that is important to you, but in conjunction with very clear language that, you know, this person died, they're no longer alive. That is important to say. Those words are important to say as well. And I would say invite the child to explain, do you understand what that means? Because very young children, remember, they watch TV, they read books, right? So they've come across probably death more than you may realize. And especially if they have pets, they may have like lost a pet fish or something like that, right? So they may tell you, yeah, like I lost my fish or something like that. So they may be able to tell you, or like so and so died in that book. Is like that? They may be able to tell you like their understanding of death, right? So you may have to clarify it for them, because especially if their understanding of death is from books, it might be like a little bit magical, right? So it's okay, but explain it to them in a very straightforward manner. I've heard parents also, sometimes describe death like, like how a car works and like, the mechanics of the car, it just stopped working after a while. Like that's how a person just stopped they just stopped working. So as straightforward as you can explain it to them, explain it to them. Use age appropriate language. The way you would describe death to like a 2 3-year-old is not the same way you would describe death to like a 10 11-year-old, right? So use age appropriate language. Ask if they have questions. You can give them a little bit of information and pause and say, do you understand what I mean? Do you have questions? You can say it back to me. And answer all questions honestly. And it's really okay if you don't have the answers, right? You can say, that's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that. Maybe we can find out together, or let me try to find the answer for that for you, and I'll come back to you.
It's really okay to.
So can I say something about, just sort of about children? A lot of children may have no experience whatsoever, and it is certainly even kids who are in high school may not have any experience with death. And so preparing them, if they want to go to the funeral or to the wake or to what other sort of gathering there's going to be, let them know what they're going to see when they get there. Let them know what the experience is going to be like. Funeral directors can be amazing resources for you in your response. They will tell you exactly what's going to happen. And you saw Wahida talking earlier about sort of cultural issues, and we've seen this a number of times where sort of different religions have extremely different ways of grieving and different funeral rituals. And so letting kids sort of know what those rituals are going to be, what they're going to see, if they're going to go to a wake, if it's going to be an open casket, make sure that the kids know that ahead of time. We also encourage parents, even for kids that are, seniors in high school. If go with your child to that funeral, even if they say, well, I want to go with my friends. I can tell you that parents sort of going with their children to funerals, it feels incredibly supportive to the kids. And there are some amazing conversations that happen on the way home after a funeral. So really, we really encourage parents to sort of support their child when they're attending a funeral. Kids may also say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say to my friend. And I think a lot of you who work with kids are very aware of the Dougy Center out in Portland, Oregon. They work primarily with families after a suicide or homicide death. And Donna Sherman, who's the founder of the Dougy Center, always says, if you are about to open your mouth to make someone feel better, don't. There are no words. One of the favorite phrases that we use all the time in our trauma responses is a compassionate presence. And for those of you that have had losses in your own life, I can probably imagine that you don't remember what people said to you. You just remember that they were there, or what they did for you. So that idea of sort of a compassionate presence, I think, is really a great idea. We tell kids, they say, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. Well, you don't have to say anything. Just show up, be supportive, go shoot baskets with your friend, or go to their house and mow their lawn, go play video games with them. Anything that you can do to sort of support them and let them know that you are still going to be an important part of their life, I think is really essential.
So I think, for kids of both older kids and younger kids, I think, sometimes as adults, we're
Not
not
sure whether or not to let, like, I think we as a are like, is think we have to do our grieving by ourselves and be like that strong person so we can take care of them. Um, but I think it's important to let kids see us grieve of all ages, right? All the way to teenagers, starting from very young kids. The only caveat to that is um, the very hard grieving, um, the the very intense grieving, you may want to do privately. But everything after that, I think it's okay to do in front of children of all ages because it's a really great role modeling. It gives them permission.
to, it's great role modeling, and it gives them permission to grieve also. It shows them how grieving is done. I think sometimes we're like, oh, if we do that,
It's a sign for them that they need to take care of us and not necessarily. I think that's why you want to do the very intense grieving on your own because that might scare them a little bit and be like, wait, if the adults are falling apart, then who's taking care of us? But other than that, I think all kinds of grieving is okay for the kids to see us do. Because then they're like, okay, um, this is how it's done. And it's really good modeling for them. So just wanted to make that point. And again, the cultural differences I do think are important, especially if they're going to, as you point out, go to wakes and funerals because they can look very different. And if you have a student,
that is going to be absent for a long time and is then returning back to class, some students may have, both the student may have some anxiety coming back into the classroom. So they might want to be prepared to come back to the classroom, but their classmates may have some anxiety about them coming back. So you may have like a session to prepare them too. Again, they may want to be treated completely normally. Kids may be really, I will never forget this. A very, very, a long time ago, I was
meeting with first graders, who
whose classmate's father had died. And I was meeting with them before their classmate was going to come back. And it was just a brief, well, how do you think he's going to feel? And they were all able to identify he's going to be sad. And I think it's going to be, how do you think, how do you think he's going to want to be treated when he's going to come back? And it was like, well, maybe he's gonna want to hug. Maybe he's gonna want me to just want to play with him, just as Jim was saying, right? And how do you think you're gonna know? I will ask him. I will pay attention to his body, things like that. So just having that short conversation with them, and then being able to voice that was enough prep for them to then receive their friend coming back like a week later. So that might not be a bad idea to prep the class as well. This was very young children. But I think all kids might have a little bit of that anxiety.
Thank you, Wahida. I think we as adults, when talking with children, often think that we need to hold it all together. And I think it's really important to know that within reason, right? It's really healthy to show those emotions and do that modeling like Wahida was talking about. The other thing I wanted to mention that we do see happen sometimes is a delayed processing for the folks that are in that kind of crisis management mode. The school administrators, if we're talking about a school place, who are doing all of the planning and communicating and checking on everyone and making sure that everyone's okay. And this loss, this traumatic grief might not hit them until everything is kind of all said and done for everyone else. And that's something that we see happen often as well. Jim, could you talk a little bit more? You touched on it already, but could you talk a little bit more about saying goodbye and the importance of those rituals?
Yeah, I think rituals are incredibly important for people. They really are time-tested ways of telling, of letting us, grieve and share our grief and let people know that we're sad and that we've had this loss. I think it really is sort of, they're just incredibly important ways to be able to say goodbye. And oftentimes, places, families, schools, workplaces will continue to sort of engage in rituals even after the funeral service. And we see this with kids, they would sort of want to talk about sort of the empty chair in the classroom and what should we do with that? And when you can, including students in that conversation can be incredibly helpful. And I think oftentimes what we see is that early on, they may want that empty chair in the classroom. And then a few weeks later, they'll say, you know what? That just makes me feel so sad. And I'm not sure that I want that chair there anymore. And so they'll come up with some other plan, and maybe they'll have a picture that will be in an area that they would sort of have a picture of their friend, and they'll sort of have to walk to that area to sort of see that picture. But so they're not sort of pretending that this death didn't happen, but they just are saying, I'm just sort of too triggered by seeing that chair be there all the time.
Thank
No,
you,
I
Jim.
think I was just going to say something else.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
This is so hard to try to sort of talk about all that we do in an hour and a half. We offer a postvention training that basically is an all day training, and even then we don't feel like we sort of cover all the material. But I did want to since we're talking about traumatic grief, I just want to get back to sort of Wahida was sort of talking about sort of models of grief and stages of grief, and there's one that there is one stage of grief that resonates for me, and that's Ed Reinerson was a psychiatrist out in the Washington State area, and he was working with people that had traumatic losses, working with a lot of homicide survivors, and late in his career, his wife actually died by suicide, which, as you can only imagine, just was absolutely devastating for him. And he talks about two stages of grief, which has always resonated for me. And the two stages are who you were before your loved one died and who you are after. And I've always sort of thought that made such good sense, because I think we know that trauma and grief change us. We don't have a say in that, but we do have a say in how it changes us. So we can have a traumatic experience or a traumatic loss, and we can feel bitter and angry and isolate ourselves. Or, we can say, this was such an awful experience. I don't want this to happen to anybody else. I want to see what I can do. I want to get active in suicide prevention activities. And we see this often with families that have lost a loved one to suicide. They start foundations, they get involved, and they are a powerful force in our suicide prevention movement. We need them, we welcome them, and they have so much to teach us. So I think that's really sort of an important concept, and has always resonated so much for me, and I think for a lot of other people. I'll put the name of the book. It's Ed Reinerson, and the name of the book is Retelling Violent Death. It's a great book about a model for supporting homicide and suicide loss survivors, but it's not really, he also has some great ideas in there too about journaling, which has really been a powerful intervention for people over the years, is being able to sort of journal about their grief or their trauma.
We have a question that has come in. I think either one of you could answer this one, but a question about what kind of information to share with parents in communications that go home regarding a student suicide. And I'm going to say a suicide in the event that the parents don't want that information shared. What would you say? And what would you say if that information can be shared?
So we have to respect the family's wishes. We tell that to students. So we can't put anything in writing if the family has not given us permission to acknowledge the death was a suicide death. The death itself is a matter of public record in most states. So we can't acknowledge that a student has died. But what we can do is we can have conversations with kids in the classroom. We can say, I know that a lot of you think we are not being honest with you about what happened, but the family, has not given us permission to acknowledge how their child died. But I know a lot of you have heard about the student death, and a lot of you have heard that rumors that his death or her death was a suicide death. And if you think it was, if you heard that, how does that impact your reactions? How does that change how you think about what happened, and how does that change your reactions about how you can manage this going forward and make sense of it in your own life? So we can still have those conversations with students.
So if you caught the nuance there, right? What Jim is doing is that in writing, you're not saying anything, but in having the conversations with the kids, you're being as transparent as possible and saying, listen, the family's not giving us permission, but then still going on to have an entire conversation about suicide as open and honestly as possible, right? Because that's in essence what you want to do, is have a conversation about suicide with kids. Because remember, I'm going to use the word postvention here. Postvention is anything you do after a suicide has happened. Good postvention is prevention. So if you do really good postvention, our hope is that you're preventing future suicides. So in having the words that Jim used, and he used them very carefully, in having that conversation with kids and doing really good postvention, we're hoping to prevent any future suicides of those kids that you're talking to. And these are very, possibly susceptible or not susceptible, but kids who have now been exposed to suicide. Right? They have a recent example of suicide and now have been exposed to suicide. And now we worry about them. So, and the point is, we want to have open and honest conversations about suicide with teenagers. You can always have the conversation about our message needs to be with kids. We can always have difficult conversations, and suicide is a difficult conversation. We can have an open and honest conversation about suicide with you.
We've got some more questions coming in. Thank you all for submitting those. The next one asks if either one of you could explain the broad concept of suicide to someone like 6 or 7 years old. What might you say? What would be an age-appropriate way to talk about suicide for a 6-year-old?
You want to tackle this, Wahida, first?
Sure. I was typing out the answer for the second question. Usually we use some language like, because we want to use brain language, right? The person's brain was not working well. And even though they tried very hard to stay alive, they were not able to stay alive, and and their brain did not allow them to stay alive, and they ended up hurting themselves. I'm trying to think of where, how old it is, 6 or 7. They're trying to think. I had the perfect language just a little while ago when I was talking about how to tell a child about a death. Their brain was not healthy, and even though they tried very hard to stay alive, their brain did not allow them was not healthy enough to let them stay alive. And I think you build off of that. The exact words are sort of escaping me.
So if I can just
Yes.
add, I'd just add to that, what I would say is, don't sell younger kids short in understanding suicide. Brian Macher is a psychologist up in Montreal, and he's done research what very young children know about suicide. And his research, I think, is very different from what used to be out there, that kids as young as 3 and 4 have heard the term killing yourself. They understand, the finality of death more than we think they do. And usually by 3rd grade, kids know what the word suicide means. And when you ask them why, how do they know? They say, well, I've heard people talking about it, I've heard my parents talking about it, or I've seen it on TV or in video games. So, I think probably kids know a lot more, and reassuring them. And I think with young kids, I think what you always want to do is state the obvious. You can say, my, your father died, your mother died, and I am so sad and about what happened, but I want you to know that you're okay and I'm going to be okay. We will get through this. We will get through this. So really being obvious about that, I think, is incredibly important for younger children, because they just see how upset everybody is, and they get scared and they're afraid to ask anybody. So they just sort of bury those questions.
And I would add to that, remember, kids and teenagers are very egocentric, so they're very focused on, and how does this affect me, right? So that point of reassuring them, but you're fine, and I, your other caretaker, perhaps, am fine also, right? We are going to be okay. And also, to add to the point of they know what suicide is, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about kids knowing about death. It is in their books. The books that kids read, like I forget, I have kids who are older now, but when they were younger, I was sort of, I cannot remember at what age, at what
Book we were reading. I'm so sorry. I don't know why people are having difficulty with my audio. I will lean in and talk louder. Please tell me if this is any better. I forget at what age or what books I was reading to my kids, but I remember they were quite young when I paused. I remember pausing because there was a mention of suicide in the book, and I did this type of work, right? So I was very cognizant of when the word suicide came across, and I was like, oh, and now I have to explain suicide to my very young 4 or 5 year old. It was like a thing that I remember being like, oh my God, we have to now talk about suicide. Because it's in their books, it's in the stories that they're reading. So it is, as a concept, they know about it.
I think we have time for just about one more question. And so far we've talked about immediately after a tragic loss, kind of the things that we would do. Could we talk a little, and maybe Jim, you could go first, and then Wahida can add in about what to do when these losses are approaching a milestone. We've talked a little bit about graduation, but any other milestones or the anniversaries of these losses, and what our best recommendations are when we're approaching those moments in time.
People are often very anxious as a anniversary approaches. They may get, yeah, we have a slide. Good, thank you. They may be sort of struggling and may feel kind of triggering early on. They may feel like they should be in a better place by this particular point if it's an anniversary. But what we see oftentimes is just that, having a plan for how you're going to spend the day, how you're going to spend the anniversary can be really helpful. And usually the day of is not as anxiety provoking or as struggling as the days leading up to it. For the vast majority of people, I think that's been our experience. And I think we have you see this sort of word that we made up here, a month anniversaries. What our experience has been with teenagers oftentimes is that, adults may think of anniversaries as years. Oftentimes teenagers may think about anniversaries as being months, so this is the third month that my friend died, or the fourth month after my friend died. And those days may be very special to them. But that anticipatory anxiety is always something that we want to pay attention to. And anything we can do, sort of any of those sort of rituals that we talked about earlier, are going to be key. And certainly the milestone moments, all those, the proms, the graduations, all of those things, weddings, all of those things are going to often feel like very powerful, overwhelming reminders for people that have had a loss.
Wahida, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that Jim did cover it.
I think so too. We don't have any other questions coming in, so I'm gonna take the time now to thank both Wahida and Jim for sharing all of your thoughts and insights. You've spent so much time doing this work over several years, and you can see that you are very passionate and have a lot of experience in dealing with these types of loss situations across the spectrum. We want to thank our staff at Mindwise and our tech support, Jen and Nick, today as well. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you have a great rest of your day. And thank you again for joining us in our learning series.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.